On November 16th of 2004, 64-year-old Mitra Simjonoska disappeared after visiting a meat market in her hometown of Kichevo, North Macedonia. Just less than 2 months later, on January 12th of the following year, police found her dead body. She had been strangled, bound, tortured, and violated, but had only been dead for around 2 weeks, meaning she'd been kept prisoner somewhere and continually tortured for quite some time. Almost 3 years later, in November of 2007, 56-year-old Yubica Lokoska disappeared while walking almost the exact same route as the murdered Mitra. She too was found early the following year, having received very similar treatment to Mitra. Then, in May of 2008, 65-year-old Zivana Temokoska received a call saying that her son had been hospitalized. She disappeared on her way to the hospital, and it was later revealed that her son was in picture-perfect health. Her body was found a few days later, and like the previous 2 victims, she had been bound with telephone cords before being tortured, violated, and strangled. Macedonian police were reportedly mystified by the murders, and there was a complete lack of corroborative forensic evidence at the scene, meaning the killer had no previous convictions, and the only connections between the 3 women was that they were all employed as cleaners for a collection of different temp agencies. Aside from that, there was no motive, no evidence, and no way of knowing who the killer might be. It most certainly made for an interesting case, and as word spread among the people of Kichevo that they had a potential serial killer in their midst, panic began to set in. The murders had also gained the interest of a 56-year-old journalist named Vlado Teneski, a veteran reporter who'd spent his career at 2 of Macedonia's most prestigious newspapers. Vlado began his own private investigation into the murders, detailing his work in a series of articles that were published in the likes of Nova Macedonia and Jutrinzik Vesnik. The Macedonian public were gripped by the articles, and for a while, it seemed as if Vlado might actually uncover the identity of the man they called the Kichevo Monster. To them, Vlado was a hero, with the articles turning him into a national sensation and reviving what had been a floundering career. But it was during a read-through of one of the articles that a Macedonian homicide detective noticed something strange. Indeed, the articles were superbly written and pinpoint accurate, yet to the detective, they seemed a little too good. Vlado was privy to a level of detail that could only have come from actually reading the case files, and sharing such documents with a journalist constituted either gross incompetence or possible corruption among the presiding officers. An extensive investigation was undertaken, but the source of the leak couldn't be found. In fact, informational security surrounding the investigation was positively airtight. And that's when it occurred to one officer that there was a second explanation as to why Vlado Teneski knew so much about the murders, one they had to explore, no matter how unthinkable it was. In June of 2008, Vlado received a visit from a pair of homicide detectives who wished to discuss his articles with him. He was only too happy to answer their questions, believing his work was actually helping them catch the killer. And in a way, that's exactly what happened, because when the police asked Vlado how he knew that the killer had used telephone cord to bind his victims, the journalist fell silent. It was explained to him that only the investigating detectives were aware of this piece of information, and unless he could point the finger at the collaborating officer, Vlado had some serious explaining to do. When he failed to account for where such knowledge had come from, the police asked him to provide a DNA sample for use in the ongoing investigation. They assured Vlado that it would be used to rule him out of the investigation, and that if he had nothing to hide, he had nothing to worry about. But Vlado did have something to hide, because when law enforcement compared Vlado's DNA to a sample taken from the victims' corpses, it came back a match. The police had finally discovered the identity of the Kichevo monster, and it was Vlado Teneski himself. Following Vlado's arrest, the police built up a picture of a man whose sharp decline had driven him to violent insanity. In the 18 months before the first murder took place, Vlado's father had taken his own life. His mother accidentally overdosed on prescription medication, and he was laid off from his job. On top of that, he and his wife apparently separated when she moved to the Macedonian capital of Skopje. Police then moved to search the Tedeschi family's holiday home, a cottage in the countryside they often summered at. It was there the police uncovered a huge cache of adult material, ropes and cords which they used to tie the victims, and items belonging to the woman Vlado had killed. Yet in a bizarre twist, police also discovered that Vlado's mother had been employed as a cleaner for most of her adult life, the same profession shared by his victims. This made for an extremely chilling addendum to the investigation, opening up the possibility that Vlado had suffered a complete mental break and had targeted the women because they resembled, or even smelled, like his mother. This also suggested that he'd had a fraught relationship with her, something his wife and friends said they were almost totally unaware of. Macedonian police were also planning on questioning Vlado regarding the disappearance of 73-year-old retired cleaner Gorica Pavleski, which had occurred in May of 2003. But following his transfer to Tetovo prison, Vlado was found dead in his prison cell on June 23rd. He had apparently drowned himself in a plastic bucket of water, his only means of taking his own life. It was an anticlimactic end to a story that had rocked Macedonian society. The idea that a man was so desperate for the respect and admiration of his peers that he would literally kill for it, and that somehow, in the course of his violent campaign of murder and deception, he ended up targeting women that reminded him of his own mother. Born on March 23rd of 1987 in Trelleborg, Sweden, Kim Isabel Wall dreamed of a career in journalism. Later in life, that dream would be realized when she was accepted to study international relations at the London Schools of Economics, with her career prospects strengthened after she went on to study journalism and international relations at Columbia University in New York City. Kim returned to Denmark with one of the finest journalistic credentials in the world, settling in the capital of Copenhagen with her boyfriend, Ole Stoba. It was there that she began to write articles for some of the most popular news outlets in the world, such as The Guardian, the New York Times, Vice, and Time magazine, and went on to win the Hansel Meet Prize for Best Digital Reportage in March of 2016. She was a woman destined to reach the very top of the journalistic career ladder. But on August 10th of 2017, she received a text message that kicked off a chain of events that would ultimately end in her untimely death. The text was from Danish entrepreneur Peter Madsen, a man known for the manufacturing of submarines. Kim had requested an interview with Peter earlier that year, and the opening of the text was Madsen accepting this request. However, there was one special caveat. The interview would have to take place aboard his own personal midget submarine, the UC-3 Nautilus. Kim agreed to his terms, arranging a 2-hour interview beneath the Baltic Sea that would take place at around 7 p.m. Kim then met with Madsen at the arranged time. They boarded the Nautilus and then set off to conduct the interview. Madsen's staff expected his return at around 9:30 p.m. that evening, yet when the submarine failed to resurface when expected, both Madsen's staff and Kim's loved ones begged the local police to launch a rescue operation. Half a dozen search and rescue teams from a number of different services pooled their resources, and shortly after 10:30 a.m. the following morning, the Nautilus was sighted just southeast of the Drogden Lighthouse in Køge Bay. Peter Madsen was rescued and was found to be in fairly good health. Kim Wall, on the other hand, was nowhere to be found. When Peter was asked where Kim was, he was apparently devastated to inform them that she'd passed away from injuries resulting from a catastrophic mechanical failure. Danish police promptly arrested him on charges of negligent manslaughter, and during his interview, Madsen admitted that he'd found her death so distressing that he'd ejected her body from the submarine, and that she was probably still floating in the Baltic Sea. At first, as tragic as it was, Madsen's story seemed to check out. But all that changed when a proper analysis of his submarine was conducted. The mechanical engineers who sought to identify the reason behind the mechanical failure basically failed to find one. To them, not only could they not understand how someone had died from the existing damage, but it almost looked like someone had deliberately tried to sabotage the submarine from the inside whilst it was in the water. When this hypothesis was presented to Madsen, and despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, he flatly denied having deliberately scuttled his own $200,000 submarine. And so, police were faced with two key questions. Why would a man destroy such an expensive piece of personal property? And where was Kim Wall's body? In the end, the answer to both questions would wash up on the beach southwest of Amma, 11 days after she'd first disappeared. On the morning of August 21, 2017, a passing cyclist was horrified to discover a dismembered human torso washed up on the beach. A post-mortem found 15 stab wounds, mostly in the region of the cadaver's groin, while a team of Swedish divers later recovered 2 plastic bags nearby, each containing a head, a pair of legs, some clothes, and a blood-stained knife. A short time after that, a saw was found washed up on the same stretch of beach, only adding to the sinister implications. At first, the police didn't actually expect the body to be Kim's, since Madsen had already stated that he dropped her body into the water untouched. But he'd completely failed to mention that he'd taken the time to dismember her before tossing the pieces into the sea. At a September 5th court hearing, Madsen asserted that Kim had died after being struck on the head by a faulty hatch cover, and that the whole thing was simply a horrible accident. Yet Madsen was unaware that the Danish police had not only seized and assessed his personal computer, but they'd also been in touch with several former girlfriends, some of whom had incriminating testimonies to share with the court. Police stated that, while perusing the files and folders of Madsen's hard drive, they had found a number of disturbingly graphic snuff films, some of which included death by decapitation. His former lovers then testified that Madsen was extremely violent in the bedroom, and they had personally witnessed him gaining gratification from watching execution videos. But without a doubt, the worst piece of evidence presented was the fact that Kim Wall's underwear, the same she had been wearing the night she died, was found secretly among Madsen's possession. Madsen had absolutely no explanation for why this was the case, and the case became destined to go to trial. Despite Madsen's claims that Kim had died as a result of massive brain trauma, the post-mortem performed on her severed head found no evidence of damage from a blunt object. Madsen then changed his story, admitting to having dismembered her, but only after she died as the result of a horrible accident. He went on to claim that she could have been poisoned by a poisonous gas leak, but again, the post-mortem found no traces of exhaust gases in her lungs. In early 2018, Madsen was officially charged with several offenses, including murder, indecent handling of a corpse, and assault. It was also implied that Madsen had extensively tortured Kim before he delivered the finishing blow, and there was a great deal of evidence to support this claim. So much so that on April 25th, Peter Madsen was convicted of all 3 charges and sentenced to life imprisonment. Peter maintained his innocence until September of 2020, when a documentary was released in which he fully admitted to having murdered Kim Wall. But less than a month later, Madsen briefly escaped from prison by threatening a prison psychologist with a fake pistol and bomb belt. However, when the objects were determined to be a mere ruse, Madsen was surrounded and rearrested just 500 meters from the prison walls. Friends and colleagues over the world were stunned to hear of Kim's horrific murder, and as the extent of Madsen's evil came to light, the world was disgusted by both his deviancy and his attempts to escape justice. Following her death, Kim's friends and family started the Kim Wall Memorial Fund, a foundation designed to fund female reporters who cover stories of cultural value. And in October 2017, Kim was posthumously nominated for Prix Europa's Outstanding Achievement Award. The journalist community felt it was the least they could do to honor a woman willing to take risks to get the truth, ensuring that long after her murderer was forgotten, Kim would be fondly remembered by those who wished to follow in her footsteps. Born in Portuguese Angola on October 5th of 1945, a young Carlos Antonio Castro has a passion for poetry, and his love of written word evolved into a playful but intense interest in journalism. At just 15 years old, Carlos moved to the Angolan capital of Luanda to begin his career as a reporter, and his star gradually rose until he became one of the most high-profile TV personalities in the entire Portuguese-speaking world. Carlos worked in the media for 35 years, mostly covering lighthearted gossip and celebrity stories. Yet in early 2011, Carlos's rich and storied life would come to a dark and violent end, shocking the wider journalistic community and breaking the hearts of tens of thousands of adoring fans. During his life, Carlos Castro broke many a big story on musicians, actors, and other celebrities. Perhaps his biggest story was his own. You see, back in 1990, Carlos was one of the first Portuguese-speaking celebrities to openly come out as gay, and was perhaps one of the first in the world to do so on live television. He later said that being free to, quote, reveal the feminine side of his personality was something that brought him a lot of joy. But given how overtly masculine Latin culture can be, he also found it extremely difficult too. Thankfully, gay and lesbian acceptance rose phenomenally throughout the late 90s and early 2000s, and by 2011, the 65-year-old was quite publicly in a relationship with 21-year-old male model Renato Seabra, who had been a contestant on the Portuguese modeling-themed reality show In Search of the Dream. But all was not well with the fledgling relationship, as all were about to discover. Just after Christmas of 2010, Carlos and Renato decided to fly to New York City to see some Broadway shows and spend New Year's Eve in Times Square. To some outsiders, the couple seemed very much in love, but close friend and newspaper editor Luis Pires would later state that there had been some friction between the two men toward the end of the trip, but nothing to suggest that anything horrible was about to happen. On Friday, January 7th, Carlos and Renato had planned to catch a musical during the early evening before meeting up with Pires' ex-wife and daughter at the Intercontinental Hotel. The women waited quite a while in the hotel's lobby, long after the couple were due to show, but instead of both men arriving, only Renato appeared in the lobby. According to the men, Renato approached them with a dazed look on his face, and when asked where Carlos was, he replied, "Carlos will never leave the hotel again." It was a chillingly cryptic thing to say, and as Renato apparently disappeared from view, the two women rushed to inform hotel security. Just after 7 p.m. that night, hotel security entered Carlos's hotel room and found nothing short of a horror show. Carlos had been beaten to death, and it appeared someone had used a laptop computer and a wine bottle as the murder weapons. But perhaps even more horrifying was the fact that someone had castrated him using the corkscrew of a bottle opener. The same corkscrew had also been used to gouge out one of Castro's eyes, but a medical examiner declared that his death was caused by blunt impact injuries to the head and neck compression, and that it wasn't possible to determine if he was mutilated before or after he died from his head injuries. Obviously, the NYPD was very focused on talking to Renato Seabra, but when they tracked him down, they discovered he was at the St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center after trying to slit his own wrists. After being taken into custody, he was given a psychiatric evaluation at Bellevue Hospital Center, but given that he was considered a person of interest, this was all done under the watchful eye of law enforcement. When he was declared mentally sound enough to be questioned, Renato stunned the officers in attendance by actually confessing to Carlos's murder. He hadn't tried to take his own life out of grief. He'd tried to off himself to avoid having to pay for what he'd done. It would be easy to assume that what happened between Carlos and Renato was a lover's tiff, a passionate disagreement gone horribly wrong. But when asked why he'd killed his lover, Renato told the police that he'd murdered Carlos in a bid to, quote, get rid of his own homosexual demons. During the remainder of the police interview, Renato appeared to be acting extremely erratically, almost as if he was working up to making an insanity defense. Yet after securing both men's cell phones, it became apparent that the couple had been arguing over Carlos's seeming unwillingness to splash the cash on his much younger boyfriend. In light of that new evidence, police charged Renato with second-degree murder, and given that he'd already confessed, there was no trial. Instead, the case was handed over to the New York County District Attorney, who recommended Renato receive the maximum sentence of 25 years to life. By January of 2013, Renato Seabra was no longer Renato Seabra. He was simply prisoner 13A0056 at the Clinton Correctional Facility in Dannemora, New York. In accordance with his last will and testament, Carlos Castro's sister would later spread his ashes in the subway tunnels that run under Broadway. Yet it seems particularly haunting that, despite the fact that Carlos's trip to New York was a dream come true for him, it was one that neither he nor Renato would ever return home from. Born on October 5th of 1948 at Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C., John Clay Walker would grow up to enlist in the United States Marine Corps and was honorably discharged after being wounded twice in Vietnam, a sacrifice which resulted in him being awarded 2 Purple Hearts. John then took advantage of the GI Bill, earning a bachelor's degree in journalism from the University of Minnesota in 1976. Following his graduation, John spent most of the 70s and 80s working as a reporter and photographer for a variety of small newspapers in Minnesota and Iowa. But then, in 1983, John and his family moved down to Mexico so that John could pursue a career as a full-time novelist. John had fallen in love with Mexican music, culture, and food, and on the night of January 30th, 1985, John decided to take a friend of his out to dinner in downtown Guadalajara. The two men had enjoyed their fair share of tequila and heard the sound of lively music playing from one particularly inviting-looking venue. John and his friend Albert Radalat wandered in the building and began to search for the source of the music, but upon stumbling into a large private party in a back room of the building, they found the welcome to be anything but warm. You see, John and Albert hadn't walked into any old shindig. They walked into the private party of one Rafael Quero Quintero. At the time of the party, Rafael Quintero was one of the richest and most dangerous narco-traffickers in the entire world. He co-founded the Guadalajara cartel and was the brother of Miguel Quero Quintero, founder and former leader of the Sonora cartel. Quintero was also a suspect in the kidnapping and murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, who had been murdered as revenge for authorities seizing around $160 million in marijuana from Quintero's cartel. John Clay Walker and his student Dennis companion had stumbled into Quintero at a time when he was at the height of his law enforcement paranoia. Their entry was like a record-scratch moment, as all in attendance turned to look at them, some looking terrifying, others looking furious. Both men tried to excuse themselves, but it was too late. Quintero's paranoia couldn't allow him to let them go. John and Albert were dragged into a storeroom at the party's venue, where they were beaten, questioned, then tortured with a variety of kitchen utensils, including an ice pick and a barbecue fork. Neither man confessed to being a DEA agent, but in the minds of their interrogators, John's Marine Corps dog tags was enough to mark him as an agent of the U.S. The cartel members then attempted to kill both men using blunt force trauma. In John's case, they were successful, but in Albert's, they were not, and he was still alive when the men were wrapped in tablecloths and taken to the San Isidro Mazatepec Park, where it was believed that he was buried alive. Just a few months later, Quintero was arrested in a mansion in Costa Rica, then extradited to Mexico in connection with the murder of Kiki Camarena. A jury of his peers found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. Following his imprisonment, Quintero's Guadalajara cartel fell apart in the early 1990s, and its remaining leaders went on to establish their own drug trafficking organizations, including the Sinaloa cartel, which fell under the control of the infamous Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. 6 months later, and following the information gained from Quintero's arrest, the bodies of both Albert Radalat and John Clay Walker were recovered from the shallow grave out near San Isidro. It's not clear where Albert was interred, but John was buried at Fort Snelling National Cemetery in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in accordance with what his loved ones believed he'd have wanted. Born on New Year's Day of 1934, Alan Harrison Berg was born into a Jewish family in Chicago, Illinois. After graduating high school, Alan went on to attend the university in Denver, Colorado, and became the youngest person to ever pass the Illinois State Bar exam at just 22 years old. While practicing law, Alan chose to open a clothing store in downtown Denver, which is where he met radio talk show host Lawrence Gross. Gross was impressed with how passionate and articulate Alan was, and invited him onto his show for what would be the first of many guest appearances. And when Gross moved on to San Diego after retrieving a lucrative job offer, he insisted that Alan be named his replacement. Alan then moved from radio job to radio job before finally settling at Denver's KOA, where he debuted on February 23rd of 1981. Alan's KOA show, which centered around politics, was broadcast in the 30 of America's 50 states, and would usually include some pretty fiery debates between Alan and call-in listeners. Alan was known for his passionate defense of liberal values, and would often arrange live debates with self-professed white supremacists, including the author of a book entitled The Death of the White Race. These debates weren't exactly clinical and usually ended with the caller hanging up as Alan berated them for holding such abhorrent opinions, but the skewering of such hateful individuals proved extremely popular with those who chose to judge by character and not by skin color. And then, in March of 1982, Alan arranged an interview with a woman named Ellen Kaplan, who was a member of the radical left-wing LaRouche movement. Kaplan had been fundraising in Newark International Airport when she had spotted none other than former U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger walking through the airport with his wife Nancy. Kissinger was on the way to Boston to undergo heart surgery, and as Kaplan approached him, she yelled out, "Do you sleep with young boys at the Carlisle Hotel?" Nancy Kissinger flew into a rage, grabbed Kaplan by the throat and yelled, "Do you want to get slugged?" before having to be dragged away by her husband and his minders. In the aftermath, Kaplan publicly announced she was pressing charges, promising to make Kissinger and Nancy into a laughingstock. However, a Newark municipal judge acquitted Mrs. Kissinger, proclaiming that her response was a reasonable, spontaneous, and somewhat human reaction, and that since no injury had been incurred, there was no case to be brought to trial. Naturally, Kaplan was furious with the result and was more than happy to go on Alan Berg's radio show to condemn the perceived injustice. However, when Kaplan called in, Alan pounced. Instead of letting her speak her piece, he attacked her as a vile human being and wished Nancy Kissinger had socked her one. Kaplan hung up after just a few short minutes, and Alan spent almost the entirety of that day's show giving her what he believed was a well-deserved dressing down. His rants were so vitriolic and incessant that the station actually received complaints from self-proclaimed political neutrals. Alan took the feedback on the chin and began to tone down his style of debate until it was considerably more reasonable. But the vast publicity that the Kaplan call received drew the attention of more than just fans of intense political discord, and to some, it marked Alan as the mouthpiece for ideas they bitterly loathed, so much so that they were prepared to kill for it. Just after 9:30 p.m. on June 18th of 1984, Alan returned to his Adams Street townhouse after having dinner with his estranged ex-wife. Berg parked his black Volkswagen Beetle turned off the engine, and stepped out into the warm Denver evening. But as he did so, a burst of automatic gunfire sent 12 bullets tearing through his body. A few days after his death, Allen's former producer told police that he believed Allen was on what he called a kill list. Allen had received a number of death threats from people claiming to be white supremacists and neo-Nazis, who were furious that he had challenged the beliefs of their movement on live radio. One such threat was from a thoroughly deranged person who believed that Jews are descended from Satan, with the same note promising that Allen, quote-unquote, wasn't long for this world. Given that the murder was quite obviously the assassination of a prominent political media personality, the FBI chose to take over the investigation and promptly traced shell casings from the murder weapon to a compound controlled by a group known as The Order. Founded in September of 1983, The Order was the brainchild of one Robert J. Matthews, with the first group's meetings taking place on his farm near Medellin, Washington. The group's primary goal was the overthrow of the United States federal government. It was named after a fictional terrorist group in William Luther Pierce's novel, The Turner Diaries. The Order's secondary goal included the establishment of a whites-only homeland in the Northwest United States. But in order to achieve such a goal, they believed they needed to eliminate a number of influential political figures, which included Allen Berg. After raiding the Order's compound, the FBI arrested a man named Bruce Pierce, who was discovered to be the very same assassin who had been sent to kill Allen. After that, it was just a case of tracking down the group's leader, Robert J. Matthews, who was said to be personally involved in Allen's murder. Then, in December of 1984, the FBI were able to track down Matthews down to a house in Whidbey Island, out near Seattle's Puget Sound. After he refused to surrender, a shootout ensued, and in the chaos, Matthews' house was set alight by FBI incendiary flares. Yet instead of surrendering to save his life, Matthews refused to leave the burning building and was no doubt overcome by the black smoke which poured from the ruins of his final hideout. By the time it was over, a man who'd wished a fiery death on so many others over nothing more than their heritage was he himself a charred, barely recognizable husk. After Allen was buried at the Waldheim Jewish Center in Forest Park, Illinois, 4 leading members of the Order were indicted on federal charges of racketeering, conspiracy, and violating Allen's civil rights. 2 of these men, David Lane and Bruce Pierce, were determined to be the planners and executioners of Allen's assassination and were sentenced to serve 190 and 252 years respectively, meaning the only freedom either of them could look forward to was death. Allen, on the other hand, remained dearly loved by all those who had enjoyed his radio show and became a scion for those who remained fearless in the face of vicious political violence. "51-year-old former police officer Wallace Souza was one of Brazil's most well-known public figures. Having been born in Manaus, Amazonas State on August 12th of 1958, he would grow up to earn degrees at both the São Luís Gonzaga College of Business and the Basilio Machado State College. Souza also attended the Center for Study of Human Behavior in University Newton Lins and enlisted as a police officer following his graduation in 1979. Wallace was fond of claiming that he had been an exemplary police officer, yet, in truth, he'd actually been fired less than 10 years into his service after being convicted of pension fraud and petrol theft. Yet this misbehavior didn't seem to bother the Brazilian electorate, as Wallace was later elected member of the Legislative Assembly of Amazonas State and had run for office after a stint presenting the highly popular but highly controversial TV show Cano Livre. Cano Livre detailed the murders of various criminal figures, and in a country with a murder rate as high as Brazil's, this provided rich pickings for Wallace and his mobile camera crew. The show became the most popular TV program in all of Manaus City, which also happened to be the location of Wallace's birth. They were extremely proud of their native son, who was essentially a mouthpiece for law and order politics and a tougher approach on crime. At first, Wallace was a superb reporter, and supposedly his status as a former police officer allowed him access to information that other journalists could only dream of. But Wallace seemed to have a little too much access to information and had a habit of arriving on crime scenes even before the police had. For example, one segment of Canal Livre features Wallace walking through a forest to examine a burning corpse. At one point, he turned to the camera and tells the viewers, "It smells like a barbecue. It is a man. It has the smell of burning meat." The impression is that it is in the early hours and that it's an execution. Certain police officers found this very suspicious, as the circumstances of the burned man's death still hadn't been confirmed. Then, in 2009, Brazil was stunned when their beloved Wallace Souza was accused of hiring hitmen to kill 5 people to increase his show's ratings. It was a shocking accusation, and many simply refused to believe that such an arbiter of justice could himself be facilitating murder. Naturally, Wallace denied the accusations, but backed away from publicity after another former police officer, Monsieur Jorge da Costa, actually admitted to having carried out one of the killings. Then, in another stunning revelation, Wallace's own son was arrested on charges of homicide, drug trafficking, and illegal gun possession, with the police asserting that he too had been part of the conspiracy to artificially boost his father's TV ratings. In October of that same year, a vast amount of incriminating evidence was found in Wallace's home, and he was eventually charged with murder, drug trafficking, intimidation of witnesses, illegal carrying of arms, and formation of a criminal gang. Yet after a warrant for his arrest had been issued, Wallace went on the run, with a team of over 60 civil and federal police being tasked with his return. Although he gave himself up just a few days into his escape attempt, Wallace continued to insist on his innocence, perhaps knowing that he'd surely be murdered in a Brazilian prison, which are known to be some of the most dangerous and overcrowded in the world. Wallace's brother, Vice Mayor Carlos Souza, begged the authorities that if Wallace was sent to prison, he would have his own cell, sequestered from his fellow inmates. During his trial, many of Wallace's former colleagues were implicated in the murders, and even the former producer of Canal Livre was arrested on suspicion of having a hand in the conspiracy. More evidence was heard that Wallace had authorized witness intimidation, and that those who could identify him as the ringleader of the conspiracy had been accosted, cajoled, and even assaulted. This was done on a partially volunteer basis too, as Wallace publicly stated that the reason he was being, as he put it, framed was because he had uncovered a large-scale child trafficking ring that had financial backing from some of the country's most prominent public figures. Therefore, Wallace actually coerced his supporters into committing the crimes for him, and this would only become evidence used to convict him of the formation of a criminal gang charge. The stress of facing life imprisonment, cooped up with people who'd do almost anything to see him dead, proved far too much for Wallace Souza, and in March of 2010, serious heart problems saw him interred in a specialist heart hospital in the city of Sao Paulo. Doctors did everything they could for Wallace, but he simply could not cope with the horror he was faced with, and died of a heart attack just a few months after entering the hospital. It was a pathetic end to a man who had profited from an untold number of murders and deaths, some of which he had orchestrated himself, and a man who had long proclaimed to be a staunch supporter of peace and justice would, in death, only be remembered as a thief and a murderer. On the morning of August 26, 2015, 24-year-old news reporter Allison Parker and her 27-year-old cameraman Adam Ward were conducting a TV interview at the Bridgewater Plaza in Monetta, Virginia. Both worked for the Roanoke-based CBS affiliate WDBJ and had driven out to the plaza to record an interview segment with one Vicki Gardner regarding the 50th anniversary celebrations for Smith Mountain Lake, an artificial body of water created by the Smith Mountain Dam. Allison was decidedly nervous before the interview, as it was one of her first fully live broadcasts on the WDBJ morning show. Live TV can be a notoriously difficult form of media, and Allison knew that a solid performance would firmly set her on the path to promotion. The interview commenced at around 6:44 a.m., with a bright and cheerful Allison greeting the station's viewers with her signature smile. She then launches into her question and answer session with Vicki Gardner, and about halfway through the interview, everything seemed to be going swimmingly. But at exactly 6:46 a.m., a figure wearing dark clothing emerges from the shadows behind Adam Ward. None of those present at the scene seemed to even notice the man at first. Adam Ward had his back to the man, so he was completely unaware of his presence. Vicki or Allison may have caught a glimpse of the man out of their peripheral vision, but each maintained their professionalism and pushed on with the interview. It appears that the man in the dark clothing was making his own recording of the interview using a cell phone, and as he draws closer to the group, the man takes out a 9mm Glock handgun and records himself aiming it at Allison's chest. Unbelievably, no one seemed to notice the presence of a deadly weapon among them, and, in a moment of confusion, the figure simply lowered the handgun and allowed the interview to continue. There's a chance the figure didn't know that the interview was being recorded live, and when it dawned on them that it was being broadcasted directly into the houses of thousands of Virginians, we can only imagine the sickening excitement they felt. Once again, they raised the pistol, only this time, they opened fire. A total of 8 shots were fired at Allison Parker, Adam Ward, and Vicki Gardner, with the attack happening so suddenly that the horrific scene was actually broadcast via the WDBJ morning show. The last thing viewers saw before the live feed cut was the sight of Adam Ward's camera falling to the ground before briefly capturing an image of its operator's murderer. When the live broadcast was cut, the feed switched back to WDBJ's studio, where news anchor Kimberly McBroom stated that she wasn't sure what just happened. Kimberly went on to state that the loud popping sounds that came from the feed could have been due to a car backfiring, but that was either wishful thinking or damage control on her part, because as the morning show continued, Allison and Adam lay dying at the scene of what had undoubtedly been a shooting. Paramedics rushed to the scene but were unable to revive either Adam or Allison. Vicki Gardner was also wounded in the attack, but surgeons at the Caroline Roanoke Memorial Hospital managed to save her life. However, it was clear she was not the intended target of the attack. Gardner's wound appeared to be purely accidental, whereas both Allison and Adam died of execution-style shots to the head, where their attackers sought to immobilize them with torso shots before delivering the finishing blow. Local law enforcement rushed into action, reviewing the footage from Adam's camera when it was shared by WDBJ. When the image of the gunman flashed on screen, the police asked the station's general manager if he recognized the man. The manager simply replied with a horrified, "Yes." To him, the figure looked an awful lot like one of WDBJ's former employees, a man named Vester Flanagan. Vester Lee Flanagan, professionally known as Bryce Williams, was born into a family of Jehovah's Witnesses on October 8th of 1973 in Oakland, California. He went on to attend San Francisco State University, graduating in 1995 with a degree in radio and television. Then, between March of 1999 and March of 2000, while Vester was working as a reporter for the Florida-based WTWC-TV, he began to exhibit some rather concerning behavior. At one point, when 2 of his coworkers pointed out errors in his reporting, Vester complained to news director Don Schaefer that he was being victimized due to his orientation. However, the 2 coworkers then filed a countercomplaint, claiming that Vester had exploded into a rage after they'd offered him constructive criticism. On top of that, several of the station's cameramen were said to routinely try to get out of working with Vester, with one describing his behavior as diva-like. As a result of such antisocial behavior, Vester was let go of from the Florida news station, but he quickly filed a civil lawsuit against his former employer. But instead of reiterating that he had been discriminated against, He instead claimed his firing was down to racial discrimination, owing to the fact that he was African American. The lawsuit was actually settled in January of 2001, with WTWC's news operations ceasing shortly afterward, so there may well have been some actual weight to Vester's accusations. But what we know for certain is that in April of 2012, Vester was hired at Virginia's WDBJ, where he began working with Allison Parker and Adam Ward. The station's management had decided that Vester's impressive resume made him the perfect fit for the station and was totally unaware of any past controversies. However, they quickly noticed that Vester was argumentative and confrontational with his coworkers. Within just 3 months of him starting to work at WDBJ, Vester was the subject of 3 separate complaints, with coworkers stating that they were feeling threatened or uncomfortable while working with him. By February of 2013, Vester's luck had run out, and WDBJ fired him on the 1st of the month, citing volatile behavior. One former coworker stated that upon discovering that he was fired, Vester began lashing out at the other newsroom staffers so violently that the cops had to be called. The station's CCTV cameras depict one instance in which Vester picks up a small wooden cross from someone's desk before flinging it at the station's manager while screaming, "You need this." His former coworkers were so frightened of some kind of reprisal that the TV station actually paid for private security to protect them, while insisting that law enforcement be contacted if Vester showed up at their studios. In the aftermath of his dismissal, much like the one in Florida, Vester filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which named Allison Parker as one of the main actors in an ongoing case of racial discrimination. However, after an intensive investigation, the EEOC decided that the complaint was totally invalid and that none of Vester's evidence or statements could be corroborated. Following this decision, we know Vester wrote a draft of a note saying that he was going to take his own life. One asserted that he'd been so filled with rage after the incident that he'd killed both of his pet cats. Between the time that he was let go and the time of the shooting, Vester seemed to be completely unable to let go of his vengeful feeling. He continued to claim discrimination on his Facebook and Twitter accounts, repeatedly asserting that Allison Parker had made a coded racial comment to him during his employment. This all seems to have just bubbled up inside of him before the hateful sentiment erupted on live TV of August 25th of 2015. He also made sure that the police didn't have to arrest him to secure a confession because at exactly 8:26 a.m., ABC News received a 23-page fax from Vester, one which was titled, "Note for Friends and Family." The note articulated Vester's anger over what he perceived to be racial discrimination and harassment in his workplace. He also referenced Dylan Roof and the Charleston church shooting that occurred 2 months prior, saying it was a tipping point in his steadily building anger. Vester went on to describe himself as a human powder keg just waiting to go boom, and was said to have professed admiration for mass murderers such as Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold, who perpetrated the 1999 Columbine High School massacre, and Cho Seung-hui, the perpetrator of the 2007 Virginia Tech shooting. Law enforcement found these final references to be extremely chilling, as it suggested that Vester planned to kill again. Yet they were also faced with the almost impossible task of tracking him down when he was no doubt on the move. Yet Vester would give them a golden opportunity to do so when he called into WDBJ shortly after 10 a.m. to repeat some of the points in his fax. Although Vester abandoned his Ford Mustang at the Roanoke-Blacksburg Regional Airport, the authorities' ability to track his cell phone negated any benefit of switching to a rented Chevrolet Sonic. An automated license plate reader in a Virginia State Trooper's car identified the rented Sonic at 11:20 a.m., but when the trooper attempted to initiate a traffic stop, Vester put pedal to the metal and tried to flee. The state trooper's vehicle was joined by several others, but the pursuit was short-lived. Vester ran his car off the road and struck an embankment near Markham after less than 2 miles of trying to outrun the cops. State troopers surrounded the vehicle, but before they could advance to make an arrest, a single shot rang out from the front seats. Vester had used the same Glock 19 that he had used to take Adam and Allison's lives, to take his own. Vester was quickly airlifted to the Inova Fairfax Hospital in Falls Church, but he was declared dead on arrival at exactly 1:26 p.m. The episode sent shockwaves across media circles all over the world. It wasn't the first time a journalist had died live on TV, but a reporter being targeted by one of their own was a horrifying new phenomenon. We can only be thankful that Vester was tracked down before he had a chance to kill again. And no matter what his final statement said, we have to remind ourselves that this was a man who admired mass murderers. And instead of dealing with adversity with respect and dignity, Vester Flanagan chose to take the lives of innocent people, reaping a terrible revenge over little more than a workplace rivalry. In May of 2015, 67-year-old Ivani Jose Metzger traveled to the state of Minas Gerais in his native Brazil. Ivani worked as an investigative journalist for most of his life and ran a well-known blog known as Owl of the Valley. The name was supposed to invoke the image of a fearless and watchful sentinel, and unlike many of his journalistic peers, Ivani wasn't afraid to report on the wrongdoings of the powerful. Ivani reported on all kinds of government mischief, from shady roadblock arrests to simple parking violations committed by government officials. He made many a political enemy in his time, but Ivani seemed to have been in no real danger until he began to investigate an extremely sinister new case. Ivani had long been aware of the drug trafficking which occurred in the Jequitinhonha Valley region of Minas Gerais. But in early 2015, he learned of another, much more subtle illicit trade that took place in the area, one that was even more harmful and dangerous than the narcotics trade, human trafficking, and particularly the trafficking and exploitation of children. Half the reason the phenomenon had gone unreported for so long was that journalists were said to be terrified of working in the region, as the concepts of law and order were only loosely applied in rural Minas Gerais. And those shedding light on the things that others wanted kept secret could expect serious intimidation. Even the politicians tried their best to slow Ivani down, but their methods of retaliation had to stay somewhat above board. However, those who trafficked in misery and death had no qualms about using violence to silence their critics, and after Ivani disappeared shortly after opening his investigation, many of his colleagues feared the worst. Several days after his disappearance, police in the town of Padre Paraíso received a call from an anonymous tipster who told them where Ivani could be found. It seems to have been implied that Ivani was okay, and they had merely been kidnapped and slapped around by those who wanted him to cease his investigations into their illegal enterprises. Yet when the police tracked down the location they'd been given by the anonymous tip, they found a truly horrifying scene. Ivani had been beheaded while he was tied to a tree, his wrists secured by chicken wire that had been pulled so tight that it cut into his skin. There was evidence that he had been tortured extensively, with numerous bruises, abrasions, and burns all over his body. His severed head had been placed on the ground in front of his body, and although it was teeming with insects and fly larvae, it was quite obvious that he had been scalped too. News of Ivani's murder rocked the Brazilian journalist community, but it was nothing new. 14 Brazilian journalists had been murdered since the beginning of 2011, and many had a good idea of why their colleague had been targeted. Given the barbarity of his murder, I think he had hit on something that was supposed to be kept secret, said Ivani's wife and fellow journalist Ilma Chavez Silva Borges, who was obviously grief-stricken but unreservedly defiant in the aftermath of her husband's murder, and it's easy to understand why. Ivani died doing something incredibly noble, attempting to protect innocent children from those who would seek to exploit them. But what's particularly terrifying about this case is the raw power that such exploiters seem to wield. Human traffickers were able to kidnap, torture, and murder a high-profile journalist, all while completely avoiding the detection of the local police. Local police have even suggested that Ivani's murder may well have been a crime of passion, quote-unquote, and arose out of nothing more than a lover's quarrel or a disagreement among friends. I think that's strong evidence to suggest that the local police are on the trafficker's payroll, as I haven't heard of many lovers' tiffs that resulted in extended torture, beheading, and mutilation. The fact that even suggests that is highly disturbing, as it's quite obvious that it was Ivani's criminal investigations that resulted in his death, all in a place where the police are not only indifferent to the suffering of the innocent, but also actively participating in their oppression. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to always clean out your pee drawer.